Hi, everybody. My name is Luke Graham. I'm the head of research at Pi Labs, and today I am joined by Sophie Taysom, Mark Lepere, and Jimmy Gia. Sophie is the founder of Kia Consulting. She's an ambassador to Connected Places Catapult, a healthcare sector panel member at the Institution of Engineering and Technology, a trustee of Groundwork London, and she established the ESG and Real Estate Group on LinkedIn, which now has over 3,000 members. Mark leads in ESG and sustainability at King's Business School, and he's the co-founder and chief science officer at OmniView, a portfolio company of Pi Labs, which led to the creation of this recent research of ours. And Jimmy is conducting research out of the Smith School of Environment and the Economy at the University of Oxford. He is a venture partner here at Pi Labs in the field of ESG, and he is also a senior advisor at Hearth Finance. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this panel. Now, the first thing I wanted to dive in with each of you on, Mark, you not too long ago now did the voiceover for a video from King's Business School and OmniView, where you spoke about the transition between ESG 1.0 and ESG 2.0 and defining those periods of ESG 1.0 from 2004 to 2018, which was from the UN's launch of taking environmental, social, and governance into account in decision making, through to the beginning of some European regulations you might be able to go into in a bit more depth, versus ESG 2.0, which is this phase that we have now. Did you want to just give a bit of context as to how you saw that and why you framed it that way?
Sure. I think the world tried to see what would happen if we allowed it up to companies to do their own thing, essentially. So that was, let's call it ESG 1.0. People were collecting data which was self-assessed. It was cherry-picked. They didn't have to collect it. It was all voluntary. And unfortunately, I think the big milestone would be that we discovered if you allow people to do that, it essentially leads to sustainability washing, greenwashing, blue washing, hush washing, whatever you want to call it, i.e. the data isn't worth a whole lot. And I think almost as a direct reaction to that, in about 2018, as you say, the regulators got together and said, look, if we believe as a financial system that ESG or sustainability data really is important to company value, and clearly we cannot have a whole bunch of data that's pretty useless. So they started saying we've got to put some rules around all this, both regulation rules, but probably more importantly, accounting rules and auditing rules. So in other words, what's emerged is a recognition that if ESG sustainability is important, it's got to be comparable and consistent with financial data. And that means it's got to fall into the realm of accounting, auditing, the data quality matters. And as I say, the last piece then is the regulators going, if you let people do this on their own, they either won't do it or they'll do it really badly. So we have to make them do it. And essentially, that's the period we're entering now. All these regulations come into place. The accounting standards are in place. The auditing standards are there. And it's just beginning to roll out and have all the different companies reporting. So broadly speaking, that's it.
And Sophie, did you want to share any short thoughts there, I should say, from your experiences around? I know, the way that we became acquainted was with your work in greenwashing in the real estate world, as an example. Any thoughts on top of Mark on that point?
I definitely agree with the direction of travel. I think it's really interesting to see what is coming out of Europe, particularly in relation to the corporate sustainability reporting directive, as well as the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. I think particularly the CSDDD, but both of them are going to have an impact on a lot of companies right across the real estate sector and larger companies across the board, both within and outside the EU. And I think we'll end up seeing a lot of knock-on effects, particularly as it relates to sort of E factors and what constitutes good and appropriate and auditable data. And I think also around human rights, which, as we know, is one of the high-risk areas right across the built environment. So I'm a big fan for regs and audits. What I am very mindful of, and I have these conversations with clients in discussions on supply chains, is how do you ensure that it's fit for purpose and appropriate, particularly for micro and SMEs, because what you don't want to do is set up systems and processes in ways that you automatically exclude smaller companies, newer companies, innovative companies. So how do you get that balance right?
I imagine, Mark, you're going to have plenty to say there around small entities, given or SMEs, given OmniView's mission. But I'm going to hold you for a moment there, and we'll come back to that. But if we then look forward to this ESG 2.0, as you've framed it, Mark, Jimmy, I might jump to you on, what are some of the sort of major milestones that were accomplished with ESG 1.0? What can be kind of brought forward? What sort of lessons or insights can be brought forward into this current state, if you want to put it that way, for not just for the built environment, say, but even more broadly?
Yeah, when we start looking at what Mark said about the financial community saying, look, this data now needs to be much more auditable, much more assurable, much more, that falls under the broad category of something that people call decision useful information. And one thing that we have to be careful of is who is making the decision. And what is implied right now when we say data is decision useful is that it's decision useful for the financial sector. And this gives us a very interesting lens, because when we peel back, what does the financial sector mean with decision usefulness? It comes down to auditable, it comes down to assurable, it comes down to transparency, but also very importantly, it comes down to comparability. In essence, you need to be able to compare companies in order to be able to understand who's doing better or worse. That's, after all, the fundamental tenet of investing, is to decide where to put your money. And you put your money by comparing objects, comparing items. And one of the challenges is that when we were in what Mark calls ESG 1.0, it was very much a mantra of something is better than nothing. Some data is better than no data. So just please report whatever you want. And that's where the self-reporting came from, and the variations of all the different ways to report. Well, okay, something is better than nothing, but now, having done that for 15 years, we need that something to become decision useful. And that is the next step that we're transitioning through right now to get to much more decision useful information.
Right. And one of my favorite metaphors when it comes to this, Mark, that I'm stealing, so more than happy to hand this back over to you, is how this played out during the prelude, say, to the Great Depression, just over 100 years ago. Sorry, almost 100 years ago. Did you want to kind of touch on the similarities there between like accounting financially versus non-financial accounting?
Sure, I'll do it briefly if it's helpful. Absolutely. Jimmy and I, in fact, spoke about this at another event we were doing. Essentially, in a nutshell, there was no modern system of accounting as we know it today before the Wall Street crash, of going way back, as you say, nearly 100 years ago now. And at the time, picking up on Jimmy's point about comparability, investors really couldn't compare one company to another because there were no set ways of calculating costs and revenue and profit and loss. And so it's now cited as one of the driving factors in causing the depression in the first place and the stock market crash which followed. So unsurprisingly, pretty quickly after that horrible experience, the Securities and Exchange Commission in America said, we're not doing that again. Let's get some rules down here. Accountants, come on, let's fix it. And obviously the AICPA, which is the Association of Accountants, essentially Certified Professional Accountants in America, the institute, basically set about writing what in America is called GAAP, which are the general accounting principles. And quickly that became the IFRS globally, internationally. They're different, but pretty similar. So essentially we've ended up with accounting standards because of I guess you'd say an immature market. Like many markets, they start in an immature way. It's a little bit of anything goes, and then gradually some market rules have to come into place to get it all straight. And crucially, as Jimmy said, to get comparability and consistency.
Right. Now, if we talk about, if I change direction a little bit here and talk about certification systems, because this is the way that a lot of this is simplified for the general consumer, right? And I very much still, even after a lot of the writing I've done on these topics, still compared to the likes of yourselves on this panel, consider myself very much a novice. But certification systems are certainly a way to help my mind simplify things as well. But a point that I've heard a number of you make is that that naturally, going to Jimmy's point around comparability, not all certification systems are the same, obviously, otherwise they would be the same system. And not just that, but they can oftentimes even mask, say, substandard performance in one area while more highly emphasizing performance in another. This is obviously quite relevant to the real estate world. Jimmy, I know you've done some work on this at Pi Labs in papers that we've authored together in the past. Since this, it seems like even more have now come into prevalence. How does this play in this ESG 2.0 era? Is this what's muddying the waters and making things more complex and making meaningful change more difficult? Is it a positive force? Is it a bit of both? Where do we sit there?
For me, I think
it's
it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think we need to start having adult conversations about what are the limits to certification. So for instance, with buildings, you can have all sorts of certifications in terms of, particularly at that kind of development stage, it's then, well, what's happening to the asset in terms of how it's used, because there can be a fundamental difference between how a building is meant to be used and how it's designed and how it actually operates in practice. So it is about asking those sorts of questions around that. Where I would have concerns, I think that's doable across the actual physical assets. Where this all gets very, very muddy is around that sort of social piece, and particularly in terms of comparability of things like social value. So that's a particularly kind of messy, challenging area where you're not comparing like for like across different places and cities and countries.
Yeah, is there then, and opening this up, obviously it's the whole floor, not just Sophie, but on that social value point, is there then a subjective element to that, where like social value to me, young family household with a hyperactive dog needs to live right next door to a massive London park. Social value means something very different to me than it does for somebody who's 18 or somebody who's 55, right? Is there an element to that as well that makes it more complex?
I wouldn't consider social value. Social value should, I think, be considered more at the level of communities and wider workforce issues. So, for instance, you might talk about social value in terms of what's a construction company doing around promoting the workforce of the future and ensuring a diverse workforce for the future. What are companies doing in terms of really encouraging and promoting local supply chain, circular economy, those sorts of things. So that's a slightly more focused way to think about social value. And then, yeah, you do have those added sort of elements. So for instance, you can have improvements in the public realm, which could then lead to all sorts of social value around improving people's health and well-being. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really long, complicated set of issues to deal with.
Yeah, Luke, when we start building on the reason for why to have a rating system in the first place, and as Sophie said, it is to understand which one's doing better, which one's doing worse. And fundamentally, again, that comes down to comparability. And the intention of using a rating system is to help make things more comparable, essentially. And so if that is the motivation, then we need to look underneath to see, well, does the rating system rate the same things in the same ways? And if they don't, then we're fundamentally not able to use that rating system to make comparisons between items. And then that gets into how is that rating system actually created? And if it's created using subjective things as well as non-subjective things, and it's a mixture and a mishmash, and you can't really understand what's going on, then it becomes a system that basically doesn't help. It's a rating system, sure. It's a certification, sure. but it's not helping the consumer make decisions, and it's not helping any investor make decisions.
And in fact, Jimmy, that's very much the story of ESG ratings as opposed to data up until now. I mean, we've had this famous aggregate confusion, this idea that I take a single company and I look at its ESG rating on 4 or 5 different of the major databases, and I get a variance of between 30 and 70%, compared, for instance, to a credit rating where there's a 2% variation. They are very accurate. ESG ratings are completely inaccurate. So it's exactly the point. The only other thing I would add to this, I think, which is interesting, is that the other side of it is how you use the data. So in other words, if I'm trying to compare Pakistan and New York, obviously it's a silly comparison. But then to Jimmy's point, investment analysts, of course not the consumer, but they wouldn't dream of doing that. You look at peer groups, you look at the same type of comparison points. So I think that's a factor for the more sophisticated audience. Where these things get really dangerous naturally is when we go in and I see a fair trade label and I go, oh, I assume it's fair trade, but actually it probably isn't anymore. So as an example, if 51% of it is apparently, but 49% doesn't matter for chocolate, for instance. So that's where it gets confusing again. I think it depends on, to Jimmy's point, who's trying to make decisions with this.
How then does this play out? So really interesting point, Mark, around the variance, right? Between, say more familiar standards versus perhaps the ESG world, as you pointed out. How does that then play? So we know, as an example, Jimmy and I recently co-authored a piece with Andrew Baum, our research and strategy partner, on energy performance certificates in the UK, as an example, and limitations there. And that's becoming increasingly well known. The work that the Better Buildings Partnership did. Yeah. How can technology serve to sort of bring in that variance, and so it's at the sort of similar levels to, say, a credit rating or anything else to that nature? I'll go to you, Mark.
I was looking around. Where are you going? I think, ultimately, technology is only as good as its inputs, as we all know. So the outputs are a function of the inputs. So in that sense, it doesn't help at all. Where I think it can help is that I think it, for instance, and I know we get to the SMEs later, but I'm not trying to get there earlier, but I think technology can make the system much more inclusive. So everybody can play if it's a decent platform that's easy to use, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that really helps. Because ultimately, ESG, sustainability, purposeful business, whatever you want to call it, I believe ultimately, although it is at its root about ethics and science, if you will, actually, the answer lies in data. The more data we can collect, the better, especially with powerful machine learning and AI and all the rest of it, the better analysis we can do, the more accurate all of this stuff will become. So I actually think the more data, the more people we can include putting in that data, the better. And I think that's, for me, the primary role of technology, as well, obviously, on the analytical side.
Sophie? And there's also a fundamental point about getting the definitions agreed. So, for instance, there's a big issue going back to EPC ratings. There's a significant issue on the investment side, particularly if you're looking at potentially investing in assets outside the UK. So, for instance, in Europe, in different countries, EPC means completely different things. So even at that level, you're currently unable to do any sort of comparable analysis. So it is about developing those shared understandings, norm standards about how you even start, what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, what good data looks like, and then you can start comparing.
Jimmy, any thoughts there? Tech, data?
Yeah, data is there. To me, streamlining data and being much more certain about data helps reduce the variability and volatility of what is going on. There still is then what Sophie is talking about, which is the categorizations and definitions of what it is that we are supposed to be measuring. Once we know what those definitions are, then we need to make sure that the data is coming from a reliable source and coming in the exact same way over and over and over again. And technology can help solve the data acquisition, data quality, data visibility, fidelity, and those sorts of issues. these societies, these standards organizations need to come up and synchronize around the definitions and the difference of options, essentially, to create and calculate what those definitions mean.
Now, one thing then on this current conversation, so data is naturally a big part not only of this recent research of ours that this conversation is launching, but also a lot of the work that we do at PyLabs, right? We work with organizations that create, analyze, report data. OmniView is obviously a part of that, Mark. But what sort of, say, sales challenge do we have? Do the likes of OmniView and other startups, say technology startups, have in being able to go to not just real estate asset owners, but SMEs, to any other sort of enterprise or non-enterprise type client, and sort of say, okay, we're going to increase the level of fidelity of your data or the cleanliness of your data, or whatever it happens to be, in order for you to make better decisions about your business, your asset, whatever it is. If it happens to then be, there's almost the ignorance is bliss, right? That sometimes it's better not to know. The less you know, the more you can kind of cruise through. Is there any perception that the more information that they draw from their businesses and assets, the more stringency is going to be applied to them? Is there anything like that? And if so, how do we sort of manage that? I'll jump to Mark first, but Sophie and Jimmy, of course, also.
Yeah, so if you go right back to the beginning of this conversation, basically, if you let people to their own devices, nobody will do anything. Okay, So really, it's a question of incentivization, apart from anything else. So there's two kinds of incentives, essentially. There's enforced ones, i.e. regulation, you have to do this. And then there are, let's call it, voluntary or economic incentives, typically in the case of businesses. So I think let's just deal with the first one first, which is there's a question, when and how exactly will SMEs be brought into this inclusive system that we've been talking about? And I think it's a very good point, Luke. I think a lot of SMEs are hoping, oh, well, look, we're too small, we're never going to, we simply don't matter in this equation. And that's just not true. For instance, if I take just the UK, which we all know well as an example, we need to think about different SMEs. So there's 5.5 million SMEs in the UK. 1.4 million of them only have 1 to 250 employees. So there's a whole load of mom and pop shops, 4.4 million, 4.0 million of them roughly, who are tiny. And of course they can play if they want to, but frankly, it doesn't make an enormous difference, even in aggregate, because they're kind of like consumers in essence. You've got this next block of 1.4 million who are really important. And then obviously you're moving up to the bigger SMEs and then the listed SMEs. So, and you get fewer in numbers, obviously. But if I stay with this 1.4 million cohort, which is an important kind of group, just to give you some numbers around that, they represent about 40% of the UK tax base. So the government's take on income tax, VAT, all that stuff is crucial for these people. More importantly, from an environmental point of view, they represent 35% of all the UK carbon emissions. So the idea that the government is somehow going to leave out about 40% of the economy and about a third of all their emissions, despite the fact they've committed to net zero, is clearly a non-starter. So they are going to be brought into this. And then I think Sophie's point, which is a really nice one about allowing them play in a sensible way and in an appropriate way. I think tax is a very good analogy. In fact, corporate reporting is a very good analogy. If you're a big company, you have to produce War and Peace, huge documents. If you're a small company, they're much tinier. And if you're micro, they're even tinier again. So I think the same kind of layering of reporting will absolutely come in for SMEs. And I think that's been pretty much indicated by everything that comes out of the government and the FCA. Onto the incentive side, very briefly, there's two fundamental incentives that we're seeing at the moment. The first is that the idea of one of the ideas of creating auditable data that can link to financial data is that you can then use it to make financial decisions, as Jimmy was saying. And the key one of those initially for SMEs is cheaper green lending. So I'm a little business. I want to convert my fleet of vans to electric vehicles. I need to convert my the machine I use to a more efficient machine. I'm going to probably have to take a loan to do that. green lending will be cheaper if we can get that system working. So that's a big incentive to a business. The other one is coming through the supply chains. So as the big companies have very strict requirement to disclose data, as Sophie was saying, on their supply chain, whether it's about carbon or social values or whatever it may be, they have to send requests down into this SME cohort, okay, and say, well, what's your carbon? So there's an incentive that if your biggest customer says, I need you to fill in this form for me, you're not going to say, I'm not doing it. Well, you can, but they probably won't be a customer for very long. So there are two kinds of incentives. I think there's economic incentives at the moment focused pretty much on lending and investing, I guess, but mainly lending. And then there's supply chain pressure from your customers, essentially. I hope that gives you some sense of A, that they will be involved, and B, why it's in their interest to be involved. The third level, very quickly, which you and I've spoken about, Luke, is that, again, once you make this link between non-financial data and financial data, now I get new insights for a company. And I can get really interesting things about, oh, if I paid my staff a little bit more, maybe they don't leave as often. And actually, there's a huge cost of losing a member of staff and having to retrain and blah, blah, blah. You can start to make intelligent decisions because I'm getting a picture of the whole company, not just, the financial. So
yeah, and I mean, to your point as well, something that's I've noticed increasing in prevalence in the level it's discussed is even quantifying, to your point around headcount and staff and labor. With younger generations, say, being even more inclined to be associated with brands that they feel an attachment to and an alignment with, and all those sorts of things. It even becomes, say, perhaps for not just SMEs, but also more specifically real estate groups, a way of attracting and retaining the best type of talent.
And touching on real estate, I think there are 2 points. I mean, for asset owners, actually that data piece comes down to bottom line, because if you don't have the data, you're spending money. We've got the energy crisis. Even a single data point can lead to potentially significant savings. And certainly in terms of essentially asset classes like build to rent, actually their incentives are there from the outset, because you have a lot of asset owners who are looking to hold assets for a number of years. So actually, if you can get down those operational costs, you're in a much better position. It's literally going to save you money. And I think it's really interesting in terms of that broader ESG social piece. And I'm always very interested in what sort of proxies are being used to, because so much of the social stuff is so squishy in a way. It's messy. It's what does good look like? I mean, you can have all the policies in the world, but actually a policy is just a set of words. So I like the use of proxies, which are in a few of the kind of more specialty type ESG frameworks, and things like, what's your staff turnover like? That will give you a really good indication of how a company is functioning. And it might be, it's more, how does it compare to the industry standard? You want some sort of turnover, particularly in larger companies. What you don't want is 3 or 4 times above the industry standard, because there's clearly something else going on there.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of an organization, Jimmy, who could do with a little bit of staff turnover perhaps is the University of Oxford. They have to force people to retire.
There's the lifers, those lifers. No, absolutely. I think that's right. One of the questions, though, and I think Sophie raises a good point, is that when she was using that example of a proxy there was a clear decision that was trying to be made, and because of that decision, we can go and say, well, what are the proxies for that decision, and then what can we borrow to bring in? And one thing that we have to be a bit aware of is that we borrow the right metrics. And we start looking at whether greenhouse gas emissions are commensurate with financial decision. Some of these more detailed nuances, they turn out that they might not be. And trying to take these various different incommensurate measures and then turning them into a single number, basically then just doesn't work. It brings people together, it brings different numbers together. I liken it to basically trying to determine a golf handicap based on how fast you ran a marathon. It's like, yeah, those are both metrics. They're both very well understood metrics, but bringing them together just simply doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? And if we start unpacking some of the ESG metrics, what we find is that they actually don't belong together. They belong to very specific decisions and very useful decisions and valuable decisions, but they don't belong together. And that's what we have to be careful of.
Jimmy,
In fact,
the correlation coefficient. Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, look, I was just saying, wasn't there a recent paper, Jimmy, exactly saying that the lots of companies who did brilliantly on, I think it was ESG generally, were the worst carbon. So you do have to break it up and look at them separately.
Yep.
If you collect it together, you have to analyze it, absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, there's been a number of studies that have been able to say that. And the one that you have worked on as well have also just looked at just the greenhouse gas ones themselves and say that these are very hard to understand and tease out. But now take one metric, put them next to 100 different metrics, and turn that into a single number. You know, that's a rating system that is built on top of 100 different metrics, which is built on 100 different sciences, which is built on, and now you start to see where the difference, where the numbers come from, and they don't come from the same place, and they aren't there to make the same decision.
And I think things like assessing according to things like carbon, greenhouse gas emissions is a really interesting point. How do you then account for instance, growing businesses?
Exactly.
Are you going to say, well, you know, your GHG emissions have gone up by 50%, so we're not going to invest in you? That's a.
I mean, there is a way of doing it. You just can link it to EBITDA growth, for instance. Yeah. But I take your point. Yeah, exactly. You have to be sensitive about it. But
yeah.
I think two things, for what it's worth. I think that everyone is going to be made to play.
Yes.
At an appropriate level. And we all need to get over ourselves and go, you know, there is no perfect data. Let's just do it really properly. Get the accountants doing it, and we learn as we go.
Start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
So then, Mark, because this comes home to you. I know, you know, Jimmy and I have discussed this topic a bit. We touch on it actually in the paper, in the Strength in Numbers paper, on almost what you could call this hierarchy, to use the phrase from Sophie, for these proxies. So perhaps one of the better known ones that touches your world is again what Jimmy touched on a little earlier around, say, expenditure and it's linked to emissions, or say, you know, the way, Jimmy, that you've explained it in the past as being, you know, for a flight as an example, you can say that there's, you know, the cost of the flight can serve as a proxy, the actual journey can serve as a proxy, and the amount of fuel consumed can serve as a bit more of a direct proxy, and getting further into that hierarchy will obviously get you say a clearer answer. Mark, how does that play out for yourselves at OmniView? Is it easy getting that sort of data? How will that change over time? You know, how does that look?
Again, I think we need to accept that different inputs give you different outputs. So we have a very simple carbon estimator, and it's billed as an estimator because it takes transaction data. We're just about to launch it in about 2 or 3 weeks, actually. But it takes purely transaction data from open banking data. So we have the transaction, the merchant name, and you can do several things with it. But essentially, you get to a spend-based, very crude estimate of your carbon. That's one way. The other, much better way, is to say, plug in your accounting system, your Xero, your QuickBooks, your Sage, whatever it may be. Now the accountant can get real invoices. So on our platform, you can choose whichever one you want to do, as you know. But so if you go the accounting route, the platform can go, so they're the invoices for the electricity, month by month or quarter by quarter, whatever it was. We can now look at the energy mixes for the supplier in question. So now you're into not proxies, but activity. This company used so many kilowatts in Q1. Okay. The way you calculate the emissions is completely different if you have accurate activity data than if you're using proxy-based data like cost, for instance. So to take Jimmy's flight example, you know the flight from Heathrow to New York, it's so many miles, you know the aircraft that was done, you know when it was done. So that's all precise activity data versus it cost me 550 quid, which is Jimmy's point. And essentially the data gets more and more accurate, the more precise activities you can get. And the key with our platform, is why we like it, as you know, you can, particularly in carbon, if I just stay there, there's now this simple get started, plug in your open banking data, don't do anything else, it's no problem, and it gets you a very crude and dirty estimate, labeled as such, but interestingly with a quality score, which says this isn't very good data, but you can have it. Okay, what we'd like you to do is go over here and do it activity based, and the quality score is starting to go up. And then if you add things like transition plans, the quality score goes up again, et cetera, et cetera. So effectively, that I think that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, and it sets me up relatively well when we're talking about sophistication of data, the level of, if you want to speak in statistical language, perhaps the correlation coefficient between the estimated and actual, and all these sorts of things. I know sophistication of data has been a very big theme across this conversation, but it brings me into one of the key areas relevant within this paper, and also something I wanted to discuss on this panel, which is around, we've spoken about asset performance and all these sorts of things, but flipping the script a little bit and looking at, okay, what are the inputs for a valuer or a surveyor, depending on what jurisdiction you're in valuing assets and so real estate assets, businesses more broadly, valuing anything really, say estimating risk. We've heard of environmental risk for quite some time now, how that can affect a discounted cash flow as an example. We know that tenant quality and energy consumption can impact the net operating income of a building. There are all these inputs now, it seems, that a valuer or a surveyor is able to take into account when appraising these sorts of buildings. And so what I find quite interesting now is, okay, how much more is sustainability data going to be taken into account with these valuations? So are we going to start seeing homes, do any of you think, as an example, which will be valued less or higher, green premium, brown discount, on the basis of their sustainability credentials?
Great question, an incredibly complex topic. The valuation piece is obviously also, what are the local market conditions? What are people willing to pay? Certainly in the context of if people are willing to pay more for, say, a green premium home, if you ask someone, will you pay more? Yes, of course. When it comes down to actually writing the check, that's a completely different story. I think where we will start seeing an impact, and I keep sort of posting about this, is around that insurance piece, particularly in terms of managing risk, all of these types of things. There are certainly places, so in California, where you simply can't get household insurance. We're increasingly seeing that in areas in Australia where insurance premiums have gone up so far that while you can still maybe get insurance, it becomes unaffordable. That is going to have a direct impact on valuations, because no bank is going to give you a mortgage if the asset is uninsurable. So it's a complex set of issues. I know Bricks have provided some advice around this, but it's still messy because it's also just that sort of sense on the ground.
Jimmy?
Yeah, I would attribute that messiness of valuation to just whether we're being faithfully representing with numbers, essentially, the assets that they try to describe. And if we can't represent it, again, going back into a comparable way, if the data is not comparable, we can't actually compare the valuations. We can't even do the valuations to understand what those comparables might be. And so the messiness comes from the fact that these data systems that we have are noisy. And if they're noisy, they don't allow us to value. And without the ability to value, it's hard to judge whether someone purchased something because of the green attributes, or do they purchase it because of a convenience attributes, or do they purchase it because of one of the other dozen different attributes that they could have gone into it. We know that there is a green attribute that people do buy from. To give you an example, the office that I'm standing in right now, when they built this space, they put in a number of air filters so that way the air was always fresh. And this was as a response to the COVID pandemic in order to make people more comfortable coming back into the office. So there's a reason why I'm here a lot. It's just because the air is fresh in here. And that was an intentional design to be able to draw people back in. That increases the value of this space, even though that is an intangible value of some sort, but it creates that social community, Sophie, that you're talking about, where because the air is fresh, people now gather, and because people gather, We make connections and we discuss and we go out to lunch together, which is very different from the other office just downstairs that didn't design themselves thinking that they needed fresh air. They have fine air, there's nothing wrong with it, but it just doesn't create that same community. And that's a value of the people to bring in. That's quite a intangible value.
I think just to continue separating the points Ruth made, because Jimmy has picked up on the value piece of what Ruth said, I'd like to pick up on the risk piece, because that's the other side of it.
Yeah.
And I think the way, from what I can see, the way the financial system is concerned about the stability of itself, i.e. that's why the regulators are getting involved, essentially comes down to physical risk and transition risk. And that's what all the new TCFD, TPT, accounting regulator, all that stuff requires bigger companies, not small ones, but big companies to think about. And they're not, once you get into it, it's not that hard, really. I mean, California is a great example. So this was only the end of May, beginning of June. Yeah. Allstate and State Farm, numbers 1 and 3 insurers, have said no more real estate insurance, no new policies. Yep. Imagine if you just put your money down in your house. I mean, seriously. And now they're beginning not to rewrite renewals. So if I have an asset, I thought it was worth X, this is what, the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world? This is going to destabilize that economy massively. Right now, it's not just because of climate change, and there is a regulatory background, but climate change is a big factor. So that's a physical risk. There are parts of the UK where you can't get insurance because of flood risk, for instance, and that's going to grow and grow and grow and grow. Then the transition risks are things like, well, if your business is completely an online business, for instance, and California's got more and more wildfires, and some of these server farms start to go out, etc. So you can start to think about it. And I think the risk side of this is the other side of the value piece. And I think it's actually as a risk management tool that a lot of people
absolutely
frame ESG. I think that's and that's probably true in the real estate, I'm guessing.
Absolutely, yes.
Did you want to dig into that, Sophie?
Quite often, I think there is something about this public perception of ESG, and you end up having all these bizarre conversations about ESG being woke and all the rest of it, where certainly in terms of the way I talk about ESG, it is fundamentally around risk management. And you do it to understand the risks to your business, to access to finance, to your workforce, to future kind of strategic planning and planning full stop. So for instance, transition risk, what that might mean for viable supply chains, for instance, what that means for your labor force. That are all fundamental issues that need to be considered in terms of the contribution of business to the economy. I think sometimes ESG is almost positioned as it's kind of going to save the world in a way. A little bit of letting government off the hook. Government still has an absolutely critical role to play in terms of providing the framework, also providing a lot of the financing, supporting a shift towards a just transition, what that means at the hyper local level, but also the regional, national, and sort of international level. What does that mean between regions and states, for instance?
Jimmy, anything to add there?
Not really. I think the topics are covered quite well.
Yeah, so me too. That's why I wanted to hand off to you. Okay, so one last thing I want to do. This has been a really great discussion. Naturally, one thing that I think is important for us to acknowledge in this chat is that all 4 of us are in very established economies. I think actually all of us are in the UK right now, although we are not all from the UK. So I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts then on, okay, we've got a massive population growth and construction boom, if you want to put it that way, in developing economies. When I speak to my friends in that world, there's obviously a lot of conversation, dialogue around, say, the embodied carbon, the carbon already expended in the developed world. How then can, the knowledge of this that we now have, data inputs, inform or empower these types of economies to be able to adopt the type of sustainable approaches to this construction that's going to be needed in order to, keep sub 1.5 and all those other sorts of metrics that we're looking at?
I think we need to be a little bit creative around how we start thinking about just transition, particularly. So in the UK, for instance, we know we need new houses, we need new buildings. Simple as. There is going to be sort of additional carbon put into the system. In developing countries, the need for housing, buildings, roads, all the rest of it can be significantly greater. So it's not putting a halt on growth. It's thinking about how do we think about this in the context of economic development, coupled with how can we use kind of new data, new technologies, all of these sorts of things. And also what, by spending over here, what are we potentially saving over here? So what's really interesting in terms of even thinking about carbon credits, and that's a whole different set of issues I don't have expertise in, is some of the programs being run are actually focusing almost on carbon avoided, for instance. So rather than planting trees, it could be, well, why don't we work with these communities who are burning a lot of wood to cook? Actually, if you work with communities and provide more efficient systems and processes, actually you're really significantly reducing not only carbon expenditure, you're also dramatically improving health and well-being outcomes, which then has, all these kind of knock-on really great consequences, positive consequences. So I think, yeah, we do need to be a little bit creative and not just, this kind of knee-jerk, all development is bad.
Mark,
Yeah.
something that Sophie said just then made me think of you immediately. It's great news for OmniView, because it sounds like a few of those inputs could be measured and processed by yourselves. As to Sophie's point around burning wood as fuel and transitioning that to alternative fuel sources, all those sorts of things. That's got to be something interesting, and gives you a much bigger TAM, total addressable market worldwide, right?
Yeah, ultimately, absolutely. I mean, I think, it comes into what we would regard as the transition planning product and the calculation. Absolutely.
Yep.
And just, Jimmy, were you going to go first? Were you going to go next, or because I
No,
could, or shall I keep going and just okay? So the bits I heard something the other day, and Sophie, you know this, and Jimmy, you know this better than I do, given your focus on the property world. But I think I read that all the buildings that will be the buildings that will be on the ground in 2040 or 50, 80% of them are already built.
Already built, yeah.
So it's a refurb problem.
Yeah,
it's much,
absolutely.
much greater than it is a build problem. Now, interestingly, in some developing markets, that ratio would be different. There'll be more.
Yeah, absolutely.
But essentially, it's a refurb problem, not just a building problem. So I think that's point one to recognize. I think that's interesting. The other thing I would say is I think there's a real opportunity. I find it fascinating that some of the most, you were talking about carbon capture and storage, for instance, or hydrogen stuff, these massively new technologies. Most of the real experimental stuff is going on, for instance, in the Middle East and places like that, which in the developing world, so-called. And that's really interesting. So there is an opportunity for technology leap here, which I think we should not underestimate.
Yeah,
I was in India, or I'm teaching a course with the government of Pakistan, actually, with some colleagues quite soon, climate finance course. And this is what we'll be telling them. There's an opportunity here. Don't play the game, leap the game and start it. There's all this new stuff out there, which I think is interesting. But fundamentally, I think it'll come down to money, frankly. I think we will have to work out a system whereby those of us who've been fortunate enough to gain from the emissions in becoming developed will have to help fund through various mechanisms, through the capital markets. We will have to help fund the transition in the less developed countries. And that's essentially, if you go back to COP26 up in Glasgow, truthfully, nobody was arguing about the climate. It was all about the money.
Yeah.
And the recent COP was exactly the same. Everyone goes, oh yeah, of course we need to do that. Now, how about the money? We're not paying. We need you to pay. I mean, literally, that's all it's about. So at some point, you mentioned we have to grow up and get on with it. At some point, that's going to happen. And maybe a carbon tax of some sort helps that, the carbon pricing mechanism.
Yeah.
But that's a bigger subject. But I think it's kind of that simple. I don't think it's all gloom for the developing countries at all. I think there's a big technology play for them by leaping ahead.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Jimmy, I probably...
No worries. I think I was going to build on that and build on both Sophie, what you and Mark said, is that it comes down to comparing futures in this particular point. When we start talking about building the infrastructures of the future and the urbanization of the developing world, developing countries, is we're basically asking the trade-off of, do you want to consume the embodied carbon today or the operational carbon tomorrow? If anyone here listening is about to buy a car or something, an automobile, you're probably not just looking at the upfront cost of what it's going to cost to buy the automobile, but you're also going to be looking at the fuel efficiency. Why are you looking at fuel efficiency? Well, you know that's what's going to be your ongoing cost for the next 10, 15 years just to be able to use the car. Well, guess what though? Maybe if a car was a little bit more expensive but have a better fuel efficiency over the long term of the car, the automobile won't be that painful in 5 years and 10 years when the cost of fuel might be going up and be volatile, right? And so I think today the real estate sector, especially new construction, has a responsibility to the future. It's not about the embodied energy of the embodied carbon of what it is today. It's actually locking in the operational carbon of the future generations, and maybe a little bit more embodied carbon today to improve the thermal envelope of the building could save dramatically operational carbon going off into the future. And we don't tend to think of it as that sort of a trade-off today. We just simply think of reduce carbon all around. Let's reduce carbon all evenly, but we utilize carbon a different way. And in some, we have to start thinking of that total cost of carbon for the lifetime of the building. And we have to start thinking about what are we locking in for the future generations? What are we locking in for the next owner of this building, the next user of the building? Are we giving them the opportunity to even live a low carbon lifestyle if we build them something that leaks like a sieve?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it makes me think a bit of conversations we've been starting to have recently around, say, you know, as we're speaking about aging populations as an example, and the type of buildings that need to be built for them. And if we kind of take into account issues we've had recently around wanting or needing to repurpose office space into resi and the inability to do that because the floor plates are maladapted to those uses and all those sorts of things, are we going to end up in the same situation if we start, you know, designing residential spaces for, you know, what might end up being a temporary blip in the population, whether that's for 40 or 60 years or whatever that happens to be, if we're building 100, 200-year-old assets. So yeah, really, really interesting point. Everybody, fantastic conversation, but all good things must come to an end. So thank you to the three of you for your time, and of course your varying levels of input, of course, onto the piece as well, which we were following today in this discussion. So for the listeners here, you can download this report at pilabs.vc/insights. We'll provide a link in the description on whatever platform that you're watching. But yeah, of course, thank you very much to my three co-panelists. Fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Luke.
Thanks very much, Luke. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Jimmy.